good afternoon, everyone. I was asked by the Mmmonk team, and very honored to be asked by the Mmmonk team to present you something or a few things on the religious landscape in Flanders during the medieval period. I shall start with a disclaimer by saying that what I'm going to say in the next 45 minutes will obviously be very superficial, because as Henri already indicated, the religious landscape of Flanders is extremely varied, extremely complex, extremely subject to all kinds of trends and evolutions over the course of the entire medieval period. And so obviously I'm going to be for some disappointing, or what I'm going to say will be for some of you disappointing, as I'm not able to go into much detail. A second disclaimer is about the fact that I will be talking mostly about religious communities as opposed to parishes and parish churches. But if you have any questions about that, I'd be very happy to answer those at the end of my talk. So I'm using 3 points of departure for my presentation, or 3 ideas, so to speak. One, that a large portion of medieval manuscripts in Flemish heritage collections come from religious institutions, as you all know, that of those institutions, the majority houses or used to house a community, either male or female, or in rarer cases, a double community. And then finally, that describing those communities and also identifying the cultural, institutional, and other settings in which these manuscripts were produced or acquired is often a challenge for people working in heritage collections. And to be quite honest, for historians too, such as myself, it's often a challenge to precisely define what kind of religious community a particular manuscript comes from. It's much more difficult to describe than you might think. The scope of my presentation, I'll talk about the 7th to 15th centuries, and apologies for the typo. The typology of my presentation will be that I'll be focusing on communities of clerics, monks, and women religious. And then finally, I'll be looking at the Southern Low Countries in general, not just Flanders. And I have my reasons for that. If you want to cover the entire period we're talking about, if you also want to look at a number of communities that fall outside of the scope of the traditional orders, then you do want to look a little bit beyond the borders of current-day Flanders. Methodologically, I'll be talking about terminology and concepts, as Henri already indicated. I'll also be talking about the development of religious life in Flanders using some manuscript examples. And then finally, I'll talk very briefly about heuristics and all kinds of repertories and manuals you might want to use in order to identify religious communities where your manuscripts might come from. So first, something about terminology and concepts. I'll be talking about monasteries, abbeys. I'll be talking about chapters, regular and secular chapters. I'll be talking about orders and congregations, also lay movements and the so-called third order, and then finally about rules and identity. So monasteries and abbeys. A monastery and an abbey, those terms are often used interchangeably in describing a religious community or an institution that house a religious community. In essence, a monastery is a building or a space where communities of men, women, or double communities pursued the religious life. We often use the term to describe an institution, but in essence, it's a building or a space. An abbey is an institution of professed religious under the rule of an abbot or an abbess. There's some exceptions to that, but that's the basic definition, you might say. So if you want to talk about an independent religious institution that is self-sufficient in a sense that it has its own leadership, it has its own internal organization, you might want to speak about an abbey. Except when you're talking about, sorry for the typo again, a priory. A priory is a subordinate institution that can function as a religious community, but is subordinate to a monastic institution. And then I see that's a sentence from the Dutch presentation was left. In Dutch, sometimes the term convent is used, which is a bit of a looser term, which is often used to refer to either cloistered or uncloistered women's communities. And then in a broader sense is also used to describe the gathering of the members of a religious community who might, in a chapter context, for instance, take joint decisions. Convent is more often used in the Netherlands to describe late medieval religious communities, which is fine. But it's in a sense also interchangeable with monastery and abbey, so to speak. One caveat is that the terminology in medieval sources, as you encounter it in medieval sources, is extremely chaotic. The definition we award to monastery, abbey, priory, convent, and such like is mostly a definition which emerged in the later medieval period and the early modern period, which means that if you encounter the term or the Latin equivalent or an equivalent in a vernacular language in medieval text, you might want to be careful about adopting that in modern day language. So if you encounter, for instance, abbatia, it could be a priory in the modern definition. If you encounter monasterium, it could actually be an abbey, and so on. So those are things to keep in mind, for instance, when you work with owner's notes in manuscripts. So those are things also to keep in mind if you're working with descriptions in medieval texts in general. Something about chapters. A chapter is a community, either a community of clerics, which is attached to a cathedral or a collegial church, or a community of often uncloistered religious women. There's two categories. There's regular chapters and secular chapters. Regular chapters are chapters where the members take vows, take some vows, not all of which are identical to monastic vows, but in any case, promise obedience and allegiance to a specific rule. Regular chapters are a phenomenon. There's a lot of debate about that, but formally and juridically are a phenomenon that emerges from the late 11th century onwards. Secular chapters are chapters where the members do not make any vows. They sometimes make formal promises, but no formal vows, as people would in a monastic setting, for instance. Those are people that are allowed, for instance, to own private property. Those are people also that are allowed to leave their community when they feel like doing something else, which is basically the case with secular canonists, for instance, who can leave their community to get married, for instance. Here again, what we see is that there is a very chaotic terminology in the primary evidence, and that you mostly have to look at how these institutions function in essence, what role they play in society. Chapters staffed by men mostly have a pastoral role to play, are entirely staffed by clerics, obviously also, and are attached, as I said, to a cathedral or to collegial church, which is definitely not always the case, or rarely the case with monastic communities. Orders and congregations, there's often a lot of confusion over the use of the term order. An order, in Latin ordo, until the 12th century basically only means a mode of life or a rite, a liturgical rite or a particular set of ritualized actions that are taken inside the context of a monastic institution or a chapter. It is an anachronism to speak of monastic orders or religious orders before 1150, because the concept of order as an organized network of monastic institutions only emerged in the middle of the 12th century, and is a phenomenon that is closely tied to papal interventions in the organization of monastic life. And we define an order as a federally or centrally organized movement of religious institutions, which is something that just doesn't exist prior to the middle of the 12th century. So, for instance, to speak of the Benedictine order or a monastery that belongs to the Benedictine order before 1150 is just not historically correct. Also, something to keep in mind is that a lot of movements that eventually became an order initially were not, and that is, for instance, the case with the Cistercians. The Cistercians, which were founded, and the movement was founded at the end of the 11th century by Robert of Molesme, founded the monastery of Citeaux, were not an order until the 1160s, 1170s. So it's always good to keep in mind, if you describe a particular manuscript and refer, for instance, to the context in which it was created and the movement to which a particular monastery that owned it belonged, not to use the term order very lightly before 1150 or before even the end of the 12th century. Very briefly, something about the third order and lay movements. What I haven't mentioned yet are lay friars and mendicant movements. Obviously, they enter the monastic scene at the beginning of the 13th century, and they have a pastoral role to play that in some ways is a competition with the action of collegial, those who work and live in collegial chapters, for instance. Simultaneous to this emergence of the mendicant orders, we also see a number of lay movements emerging. Well, actually, I should correct that a little bit. We don't see them actually emerging. We see them being integrated into the church system around the year 1200 and the first decades of the 13th century. And so often often in the older literature, you see, for instance, mentions of the first reference to a Beguine community in the middle of the 12th century in the middle of the 13th century, sorry, in a particular town. Keep in mind that often means that those Beguines were there and present much longer than that and long before that, but that they only became noticeable in documents from ecclesiastical institutions from the middle of the 13th century onwards, for instance. So often we get to see these lay movements at the point in time when they're integrated into the ecclesiastical system. And then the mendicant orders play a big role in that, and they all often have male and female branches of lay people who take a number of vows, but not all vows of obedience and stability and such like, and live in community, but are not considered entirely a part of the religious order. There's also a number of lay movements, especially towards the end of the medieval period, which I'm sure you heard about, broeders and zusters of van het gemene leven, brothers and sisters of the common life, anything to do with the Devotio Moderna and all the spin-offs of the Windesheim movement, obviously. I could talk about that for a long time, but I don't have the time, unless Evelyn tells me that we can go on until 6 or something, but I don't think that's what she wants. Something about rules and identity, which I think is important also to understand the culture of religious communities in the medieval period. Talking first about the period before 800, you have to realize that most communities basically followed their own rule. It's a very recent development in scholarship that we're now increasingly seeing that just about every single monastic institution in the West basically had made their own mashup of different rules that were in circulation at the time. If we find rule books from that particular period, we often see that they are a combination of different traditions, and that local people, local monks and local women religious often put their own emphases in these rules. So to speak, for instance, of a Benedictine abbey before 800 is an anachronism, because we know that they never followed, for instance, the rule of Saint Benedict to the letter. That's almost a rule. We can never know for sure, but it's something we are pretty sure of. Even for the period between 800 and 1200, historians often have difficulties in determining exactly what was the observance of a particular community. And this might sound surprising given the fact that, of course, there were a number of reform movements from the beginning of the 9th century and ongoing through to the 12th century. However, again, if you look at documents of practice from these institutions, if you look at manuscripts with monastic rules, you often see that local cultures of reflection, local cultures of debate brought significant changes to these rules, and that the observance of the people who lived there was often significantly different than the prescriptions we find in normative texts such as rules. That explains to an extent why the terminology of medieval texts is so ambiguous. You sometimes have especially female communities of that particular period often refer to themselves as either canonesses in one text or as Benedictine nuns in another. And sometimes it's quite hard to determine what kind of life they actually lived. What we also see is that rules were often considered within the context of these communities as sources of inspiration rather than as law texts. And again, that is something which is important to remember because it explains to a significant extent why we're finding so many traces of what you might call ambiguous lifestyles, but also ambiguous reading cultures within these institutions. And by ambiguous reading cultures, I mean that is that you often see that within these institutions, people read a wide variety of texts that didn't necessarily conform with a particular strand within monastic life, a particular movement within monastic life, so that they, went picking whatever they found interesting from different inspirations. And that reflects to an extent the fact that they themselves constructed their identity from different inspirations. Right, so now I come to the second part of my presentation on the development of religious life in Flanders, using some manuscript examples, most from the Mmmonk database, but some from other places. So I'm going to give you a sort of a chronological survey of the development, very superficial again, because I don't have the time to go into much detail, a sort of chronological survey of the development of religious life with some examples each time. For the very earliest period, when we're talking about the 6th to 8th century, we're looking at a religious landscape that was occupied mostly by aristocratic foundations of monastic communities, which were mostly rural and mostly very small. At the right side of the slide, you can see an image, a reconstructed image, obviously, of a female community at Hamage, just across the French-Belgian border, or the Belgian-French border, rather, not too far from Douai. So, communities that often didn't really look very much like you would imagine a medieval monastery. These institutions, as I already said, or these communities often lived according to mixed rules that were taken or put together from different inspirations. And for Hamage, for instance, we know that they used a combination of the rule of St. Columbanus and the rule of Saint Benedict, with some elements added from local tradition, which means that in most cases, their culture is very difficult to reconstruct. Their liturgical culture, also their reading culture in general, is very difficult to reconstruct. Their daily life is also very difficult to reconstruct, unless you have primary sources that actually describe what went on in that specific institution. May not be a very uplifting thing to hear if I say that it's actually quite hard to know how people in religious communities in that period lived, but it's a reality we have to face at this point in time. An example, well, we don't have that many examples in Flanders of manuscripts from that particular period, but this manuscript, or this fragment from the University Library in Ghent of a letter by Jerome, is described on the website of Mmmonk as one of the oldest witnesses of books made in Flanders. I don't know if that is actually correct, because to me it looks like a manuscript that was made in Italy and then at some point imported to Flanders in maybe the 8th or the 9th century. In any case, it shows that there was circulation of manuscripts even in that very early period, and that manuscripts from very, very distant lands sometimes arrived in our regions. Another example of that is the Codex Aicensis, famous manuscript now preserved at the museum in Maaseik, which is a set of gospels inspired by artistic and literary tradition from England, obviously Northumbria probably, and then made in Echternach, the Abbey of Echternach, which was heavily inspired and also staffed by people from the British Isles in that particular period, and was then probably donated to the female community of Aldenegg in the 9th century. The 8th and 9th centuries mark a phase of integration, and at the right side of your slide you can see a reconstructed image of what the same abbey I showed you just a few minutes ago of Hamage looked like. You see a complete transformation of the layout of the monastery. You see a complete transformation of the way in which people have to live together within that monastery, even without talking about how life might have been in this place, how liturgy might have been organized. You can immediately see that quite a bit must have changed. And that happened mostly under the influence of what we call the Carolingian reform movement, which is a term that's heavily debated at the moment. But what we can see is that well, to use an anachronistic description, you could say that a lot of monasteries in this particular period were nationalized by the Frankish rulers and integrated into the Frankish church, also integrated into the Frankish state. There's all kinds of ideological and political reasons for that, which I won't go into now unless someone has questions about that at the end of the presentation. But what we do see is that there is an increase of cultural and institutional integration between monastic institutions. Although, each individual monastic community still followed their own particular rule, still followed their own traditions, still put their own emphases in terms of how they organized life, in terms of their spirituality, and so on. What you can see is that there is an increased circulation of manuscripts, an increased circulation also of social and cultural capital in general. An example of that is an antiphonary from after the use of Rome from the Abbey of Saint Peter's in Ghent, which indicates that there was quite a bit of liturgical integration going on at the end of the 8th and early 9th centuries. So liturgy becomes more, not entirely, but more standardized in this particular period. The 10th and 11th centuries are marked by new challenges for religious life. The 10th century, as I'm sure you all know, was a difficult period in many respects, turmoil, invasions, a brief phase of decline also in agricultural output, which led to a complete restructuring of the political landscape. And it had significant impact on religious institutions, which were basically re-privatized again, to use an anachronism again. So local lords and bishops mostly took over in controlling these religious institutions. And what we see is that along with that process, we also see another process where the rule of Saint Benedict is heavily being promoted. This promotion is interesting in the sense that it has been described as a precursor of a sort of homogenization of monastic life in the later 10th and early 11th centuries. But what we also see is that a significant number of secular chapters and collegial churches are being founded. The reasons for that is still not entirely clear. What we do see is that a lot of monasteries are being taken over by the nobility and by bishops to continue functioning as they were, but also to serve as dynastic sanctuaries and necropolies for clerical rulers, but also for families from the nobility. In the case of secular chapters, we all often see that more or less the same is going on, but in that particular case with the foundation of collegial churches, especially you get families from the aristocracy that are not wealthy enough to take over an entire monastery, but do want some kind of dynastic commemoration to be going on in a particular church, and for that they put a couple of priests in a particular church, maybe found a church and put a couple of priests in there who can then pray for their eternal salvation. The 10th and 11th centuries are again marked by the creation of new networks that have a slightly different character than those from the 9th century, in the sense that they're more autonomous. So these networks are more between monastic leaders and between monastic institutions, and you get a slightly different type of integration going on. Whereas in the 9th century, the integration was very much directed top-down by the Carolingian rulers who wanted every single monastery to observe the same liturgy. If you look at the 10th century, you see more the monks themselves, the women religious themselves, who try to connect with other communities because they're interested in acquiring manuscripts, because they're interested in acquiring know-how on how to govern a monastery, how to organize the worldly properties of a particular institution, and so on and so on. A few examples of the increased emphasis on the rule of Saint Benedict in the 10th century. This is a sort of a spin-off text from the rule of itself. It's the 9th century commentary by Smaragdus on the rule of Saint Benedict from the Abbey of Saint-Beuve. A wonderful manuscript, very nicely written, early 11th century. And I'm trying to go to the next slide, but it's, oh, sorry about that. Yeah, this is a very neat example, which is not in the Mmmonk database, but might be at some point. This is the role of Maubeuge. Maubeuge is a female community which was founded in the 7th century. In the 11th century, the women of Maubeuge made a roll, and you don't encounter rolls of that vintage very often. We're talking 11th century. Most rolls we know are later and are mostly necrological documents if they come from religious institutions. This is a role in which the women essentially described their identity as a female religious community. And what you have is a description of the life of the founder, Saint Aldegonde, the oldest charter they had in their archives, and then followed by a whole series of excerpts from different rules which the women put together as if to show that they were actually making their own discipline, making their own observance from these different traditions. We have no other medieval manuscripts from Maubeuge except for this particular role, but this document tells us quite a bit about the reading culture of these women, which must have been quite rich. The late 11th and early 12th centuries show again increasing integration in what you might call self-made movements, confraternities, confederations, and congregations. Sorry, again, I should have translated that. All kinds of organizations which are bottom-up forms of collaboration between religious institutions that are not directed by the ecclesiastical authorities or by lay rulers. They tend to be very informal. They tend to be quite ephemeral also. So we'd see a number of confederations, congregations, confraternities emerge over the course of the 11th century and then disintegrate again towards the turn of the 12th century. This movement coincided with, or this trend coincided with, an increasingly diversity of the religious landscape. As you know, the 11th century saw the emergence of apostolic movements, eremitical movements. Then moving on into the 12th century, also have the military orders, all kinds of movements that challenge the old way of organizing religious life within monastic institutions, and that also adds an element of agency to people pursuing, or to the life of people pursuing the religious life. Apostolic movements, for instance, the Augustinian canons and the Premonstratensians, they go preaching, they go converting also certain parts of the European landscape. Eremitical movements advocate a return to an austerity that was inspired by the Desert Fathers. And then the military orders, I don't need to explain that. Obviously, they derive from all kinds of charitative, but also military movements that were active from the late 11th century onwards in the Middle East. Again, as I already mentioned, when talking about monastic orders in that period, please be careful, because the formation of monastic orders was a very gradual process, a very incomplete process, and certainly also one in which the people who participated in it would always show where it would end and what the result would be. So the formation, for instance, of the Cistercian order was a very uncertain process that only began to show real results towards the third quarter of the 12th century. Before that, there wasn't really an order. A couple of examples of integration, again, for instance, the influence of Cluny in the Southern Low Countries was felt from the late 11th century onwards. This is a little bit more recent. This is a coutumier, so it's a description of the customs of the Abbey of Cluny from the Abbey of Saint-Tron, Sint-Truiden, from circa 1160. These manuscripts have often been used to argue that, or the presence of these manuscripts in a particular convent library or monastic library have often been used to argue that a particular community then joined the Cluniac movement. Now we know that these manuscripts were often acquired because monks just wanted to know what the Cluniacs were doing, not necessarily because they wanted to adopt their lifestyle. Another example of exchanges and permeable boundaries between religious movements. This is if I remember correctly, a manuscript given by a canon of the Church of Saint Donaas in Bruges to the Abbey of Tenduinen near Kokzijde. It shows you again how literary cultures, reading cultures overlapped very much, and that people who were active in one particular strand of the religious life were often communicating with people in other movements. And so that in hindsight, to erect boundaries between these different movements and to say that they were completely distinct in terms of their reading culture, their intellectual culture, would be a fallacy. Same goes for this one, also a manuscript from Tenduinen, a copy of De Contemptu Seculi of Peter Damien. Peter Damien was definitely not a Cistercian, as the monks of Tenduinen were, but he nevertheless was an inspiration to them, even if the model he advocated in his work was actually an eremitical one, which was, again, not what the Cistercians were pursuing. Here again, a famous example, Liber Floridus of Lambert of Saint-Omer, 1120s, 1140s, an important manuscript because it again shows you the exchanges between representatives from different religious movements. In this particular case, we have the canon Lambert of Saint-Omer, who is actually using quite a bit of reading material from the Abbey of Saint-Bertin and a number of neighboring abbeys to construct his wonderful encyclopedic work. The later Middle Ages, I'm going to squeeze 3 centuries together, I'm sorry for that, but are a period of challenges, competition, and reform. What we see is that a number of movements start contracting towards the end already of the 12th century. We see that with the Benedictines, the Cistercians, even the Premonstratensians have significant difficulties expanding. We also see that they are struggling with the problem, so to speak, of the presence of women in their movement. And so especially the Premonstratensians try to get rid of a female branch, at which they fail in the end, but still. Following that, in the early 13th century, we see a number of papal interventions. So there's more regulation going on from the early 13th century onwards. Popes try to impose their own rules on monastic institutions, on religious communities in general, and also for the first time define monastic rules as law texts, which is something completely new in the culture of the medieval period. Competition of new movements, that's something obvious, and especially lay movements exercise quite a bit of pressure on these traditional monastic orders, which often struggle with financial difficulties, difficulties with recruiting new members, and so on and so on. Difficulties also with the church authorities and lay authorities who often want to replace them by other movements that are more inclined to support their interests. Couple of examples of the influence of papal authority on these religious institutions. 2 examples, one from Saint-Bavon and one from the Abbey of Tenduinen, or Les Dunes. The decretals of Gregory IX are an important landmark shift, or mark an important landmark shift in the history of religious communities, because for the first time it's actually described how they need to organize themselves, in orders, and how they need to report every few years about their activity as a whole, as a movement, as an order to Rome. The other side of the story is then a copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict and Papal Constitutions, 15th century manuscript from the Abbey of Saint-Bavon, which again shows that this papal impetus to regularize monastic life and make it more conform their own expectations, to make it more homogenized, also had an impact on reading culture within these institutions. So what you see is that a number of monastic leaders from the 13th century onwards do indeed try to create a fixed normative framework for life within their own institutions. Indicative of changes in the recruitment of some of these communities is the example on the left, which is a copy of the Dutch commentary on the rule by Olivier de Lange, the prior of the Abbey of Saint-Bavon. It's an interesting manuscript because it shows you that, and he talks about that in the manuscript itself, that a number of monks in the community didn't actually understand Latin and so needed a vernacular introduction to the basics of their life. It tells you something about the limited recruitment pool from which Benedictine monasteries in the later Middle Ages could actually, or the limited recruitment pool they had to work with in the later medieval period. From the same author, we also have a life of Saint Coletta of the Coletinen, which is a movement deriving from mendicant traditions in the later medieval period for women then. It's interesting in the sense that this is a Dutch translation of a Latin text that originated in France and that was important in the Low Countries. And instead of having someone who was very closely affiliated with the Colettine movement, among other places in Ghent, they had the Benedictine monk make the translation, which again shows you that the boundaries between religious movements were quite permeable. Same goes for this manuscript of the letters of Bernard of Clairvo, one of the principal figures of Cistercian life in the 12th century, from St. Peter's, from the, if I remember correctly, the 14th century. Here again, influence of the Devotio Moderna, and then all that has to do with that in the 14th and 15th century in the Cistercian institutions in what is now West Flanders and in the Ghent monasteries. And there's multiple examples of that where you can see that in the 14th and especially in the 15th century, so-called traditional movements were quite closely following what was going on in these new lay modern devotion movements. I won't dwell too much on that. A final example I want to show you is the Chronicle of Bills. The Chronicle of Bills is a very neat manuscript, which I'm studying at the moment. It's a small chronicle made by a priest from a collegial church in what is now Netherlands Limburg. Is so a man called Peter Trekpoel, who was active in a collegial church in Geulen and then in Sittard, and then towards the end of his life moved to what is now the Belgian town of Bilzen, where he became the confessor of the local community of women religious from the Third Order of Saint Francis. This manuscript, which is in a very poor condition, as you can see, is fascinating in the sense that it reveals to us again how communities that usually don't, in terms of their manuscript culture, don't really come on our radar, are still perceptible in a number of manuscripts, most of which are unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but curiously sometimes preserved in archival collections. Very interesting manuscript. Then something about heuristics and manuals. I won't dwell too much on that. There's a lot I could say about that. It's a very complex thing to research monastic institutions and their history, but just very briefly and superficially, I'll give you a couple of introductions to the history of monastic life in general. The book by Gert Melville is a good reference and a very exhaustive reference. More didactical are those by André Vaucher and Cécile Cabi, L'Histoire des moines, chanoines et religieux au Moyen Âge. And then finally, there's my own handbook, which was made for students, but which might be useful to some of you. Surveys in general of religious institutions have existed since the 18th century and are still in use. An example of that is the Gallia Christiana, which was first published, or the first volume was published in 1715, and which basically aims to give a full catalogue of all religious institutions on what was then French territory. Still very interesting for us because these French were quite expansive in their perception of what French territory actually constituted. So a large part of the southern Low Countries is actually covered in that manual. The Gallia Christiana is mostly still interesting because the compilers used sources that were lost at the time of the French Revolution and in the 19th century. So there's quite a bit of information in that which is still relevant and which cannot be accessed in any other way. If you're looking for maps, a good map is that still by Edouard de Moreau and Antoine de Gelling in l'Histoire de l'Église en Belgique, in the 6th volume, actually, of that publication. I believe there's a copy circulating online. So if you Google then you can easily find it. And if you can't find it, you're free to email me. Another repertory, or two repertories I won't talk too much about, are the Répertoire topobibliographique des abbayes prieurés and the Dictionnaire d'histoire et de géographie ecclésiastique, which are basically catalogues, inventories, alphabetical inventories, among other things, of religious institutions. Specific inventories or surveys are those in the Monastical Belge. The Monastical Belge covers the traditional monastic orders, Benedictines, Cistercians, also to an extent Augustinian canons, and premonstratensians, but not the Mendicant orders and not the lay movements. And the same goes for Jean Becquet's Abbaye et Prieuré de l'Ancienne France, which are quite hard to navigate, to be honest, but are still quite interesting if you want to quickly get a sense of the history and the identity of a particular community. For these later movements, we have a number of monastica, so surveys of religious communities, for Windesheim, for, again, the premonstratensians, for the Carthusians, for the communities of the common life, and so on and so on. They're treated quite exhaustively, if I can they're treated quite exhaustively in this particular handbook, Typologie en Heuristiek van de bronnen voor de geschiedenis van de middeleeuwen, which is published in Dutch, but still gives you a good, if you're willing to work a little bit with DeepL or with Google Translate, it might be quite useful to have a look at that, because it gives you quite an exhaustive list of all relevant repertories for the Low Countries. Primary sources, I had been thinking of giving quite an exhaustive description of the types of primary sources we can work with if you want to look at the history of these religious communities. But in all honesty, that's far too much to cover in this particular presentation. So I'm just going to mention a couple of databases, narrative sources from the Low Countries, which aims to give a full inventory of all narrative texts that were preserved from the Low Countries in general, so also the Netherlands, between the beginning of the medieval period and the early 16th century. For archival sources, we do have the Diplomata Belgica, which is a database of all charters issued or received on Belgian territory up to the year 1200. There's other databases which are described again in Typologie en Heuristiek. Again, I'm the author, I'm one of the co-authors of this book, but I don't have any royalties from it, so you can, it's not as if this is an advertisement for my own financial gain. Inventories of archives, I could again talk about that quite at length. Quite a few of those are described in the repertories I just mentioned in the previous slide. And then again, if you want to reconstruct the reading culture, for instance, if you're interested in that, or reconstruct a library, we can use a wonderful resource that are lists of books, library catalogs that are preserved from the medieval period, which were partly edited by Albert de Rollet, and there's always a couple of more turning up in unexpected places. The final slide of this presentation is called Ask an Expert. And why do I say this? Not because I don't trust that you can do all the research yourself, but because this is such a complex topic and such a difficult thing to research that it's often quite useful to just ask an expert. That might be a colleague who's working in a heritage institution, that might be someone who is working in a library, or that might be an academic. I, for one, am available for all your questions, not only now, but also afterwards. If you have any questions about religious institutions in the Low Countries, I'll be happy to try and help. That is the end of my presentation. I thank you for your attention.